The morning sun had barely touched the steel towers of Draconis Prime when Kale finished shoveling the last pile of nutrient waste from the dragon pens. His arms burned from hours of work, and his simple worker's tunic was soaked through with sweat. At 17 years old, he had spent the last 4 years of his life cleaning these massive enclosures, feeding the ancient creatures that lived within them, and dreaming of a life he would never have. The dragons of Draconis Prime were not the fire-breathing beasts of old Earth legends. They were something far more terrifying and beautiful. Each one stood nearly 40 feet tall at the shoulder, their scales shimmering with bioluminescent patterns that shifted with their moods. They were living weapons, bonded to the noble houses of the Galactic Imperium, and they had been the deciding factor in every major war for the past 3,000 years. Their intelligence matched that of any sentient species, and their psychic abilities allowed them to communicate directly with those they chose to bond with. Kale had never spoken to a dragon. He had never been close enough to touch one. Stable boys like him were invisible, beneath notice, nothing more than the hands that kept the pens clean and the food arriving on schedule. The noble dragon riders who came each morning to fly their magnificent partners never even looked in his direction. To them, he might as well have been part of the machinery that kept the facility running. Today was supposed to be like any other day. Kale would finish his morning duties, grab a quick meal of synthetic protein in the workers' mess hall, and then return for the afternoon feeding. He would watch the dragons take flight through the observation windows, their massive wings catching the thermal currents that rose from the planet's volcanic core, and he would wonder what it felt like to be so free. But the universe had other plans. The alarm began as a distant wail, the kind of sound that made your bones vibrate with unease. Kale had heard alarms before, but nothing like this. This was the emergency broadcast system, the one they told you about during orientation but assured you would never actually activate. It meant that something catastrophic was happening, something beyond the normal dangers of living on a world inhabited by creatures capable of leveling cities. Through the reinforced windows of the stable, Kale could see the sky changing. The familiar orange glow of Draconis Prime's perpetual twilight was being swallowed by something dark, something that moved with purpose. Ships. Thousands of them. They poured through the upper atmosphere like a plague of locusts, their designs unfamiliar and unsettling. They were not Imperial vessels. They were not anything Kale had ever seen in his training materials or the entertainment feeds. The HFY had come. Every human child learned about the HFY in their earliest education cycles. They were the great enemy, the species that had nearly wiped humanity from existence during the first contact wars 2,000 years ago. They were insectoid nightmares, hive-minded and utterly alien in their thinking. They did not negotiate. They did not take prisoners. They consumed and they expanded, and, for centuries the only thing that had held them at bay was the combined might of the Galactic Imperium and its dragon riders. But the HFY had been quiet for generations. Most people had started to believe they were a problem solved, a danger from the history books that would never return. Those people were about to learn how wrong they had been. The first explosions rocked the stable complex, sending Kale tumbling to the ground. Around him, the dragons began to roar, their voices creating a wall of sound that threatened to shatter his eardrums. He could feel their agitation, their fear, their rage, all of it washing over him in waves that seemed to bypass his ears entirely and go straight into his brain. He had never felt anything like it. For just a moment, the sensation was so overwhelming that he forgot about the invasion, forgot about the danger, forgot about everything except the impossible fact that he could somehow sense what the dragons were feeling. The stable doors burst open, and a group of dragon riders came sprinting through. They were wearing their flight suits, the advanced armor that protected them from the stresses of high-altitude combat, and their faces were masks of controlled panic. Kale recognized the lead rider as Lord Varen Drakemore, the commander of the Draconis Prime Dragon Guard. He was a tall man with silver hair and the kind of face that looked like it had been carved from stone. He had never once acknowledged Kale's existence. Today, however, Lord Varen's eyes swept across the stable and landed directly on Kale. Something flickered in that hard gaze, something that might have been surprise or recognition. Then, the moment passed, and Lord Varen was barking orders to his riders. "Get to your dragons. Launch immediately. This is not a drill. We are under attack by a HFY invasion fleet of unprecedented size. The orbital defense platforms are falling. The ground batteries will not hold for long. We are the last line of defense for this world." The riders scattered, each one running to their designated pen, their bonded dragon waiting for them with scales glowing bright with battle readiness. Within minutes, the stable was nearly empty. The massive doors at the far end of the complex groaned open, and the dragons launched themselves into the burning sky, their riders clinging to their backs as they rose to meet the enemy. Kale stood alone among the empty pens, uncertain what to do. His training had not covered this situation. The worker protocols said he should report to the emergency shelters deep underground, where the non-combat personnel would wait out whatever disaster was unfolding above. But something held him in place. Something called to him from the depths of the stable, from a section he had never been allowed to enter. The ancient pens. Every stable complex had them, though most workers went their entire careers without ever seeing what was inside. The ancient dragons were the oldest of their kind, creatures that had bonded with human riders during the First Contact Wars and had outlived their partners by centuries. They were said to be too powerful to control, too dangerous to release, and too valuable to destroy. So they remained in their pens, sleeping through the ages, waiting for something that nobody quite understood. Kale had cleaned the corridors outside the ancient pens. He had felt the strange energy that radiated from behind those sealed doors, a pressure that made his thoughts feel slow and heavy. The other workers told him to ignore it, to stay away, to pretend that part of the stable did not exist. But he had always been drawn to it, the way a moth is drawn to flame. Now, with the world ending around him, he found his feet carrying him toward those forbidden doors. The security systems that normally would have stopped him were offline, their power redirected to the defense grid. The doors that should have required multiple authorization codes and genetic verification stood slightly ajar, their locks released by some glitch in the emergency protocols. Kale pushed through them, stepping into darkness that seemed to swallow the light from the corridor behind him. He could not see anything, but he could feel something. A presence. No, multiple presences. They were vast and ancient and terrible, and they were aware of him in a way that made his skin crawl with primal fear. These were not the dragons he had spent years caring for. These were something else entirely. These were the legends made flesh. A voice spoke in his mind, and it nearly drove him to his knees. You are not a rider. The words were not words at all but concepts, images, sensations pressed directly into his consciousness with the force of a hammer blow. He struggled to form a response, to push his own thoughts outward in a way he had never tried before. No. I am just a stable boy. I clean the pens. I should not be here. Silence followed, stretching out for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. Then, another voice joined the first, this one older and deeper, like the grinding of tectonic plates. You feel what we feel. We have been watching you. Kale's heart stopped. Watching him? The ancient dragons had been watching him? He was nothing. He was less than nothing. He was an orphan from the lower habitation levels who had been given a job shoveling waste because no one else wanted it. He had no family, no connections, no special abilities. He was just a boy who had always been able to sense when the dragons were hungry or tired or upset, something he had assumed everyone could do. A new voice, feminine and sharp like breaking glass. The riders cannot feel us. They have their bonds, their partnerships, their limited connections. But, you, child of humanity, you feel all of us. You have felt us since the day you arrived. The darkness began to lift, and Kale found himself standing in the largest enclosure he had ever seen. It stretched outward in all directions, disappearing into shadows that his eyes could not penetrate. But he did not need his eyes to know what was there. He could feel them, 5 massive presences arranged in a loose circle around him, each one radiating power that made the younger dragons seem like candle flames compared to the sun. The nearest dragon lowered its head until its eye, larger than Kale's entire body, was level with his face. Its scales were not the bright colors of the younger dragons but deep black shot through with veins of silver that pulsed with inner light. This was Azrith the Eternal, the dragon who had destroyed the Zyrketh High Fleet at the Battle of Scorched Moons. Every child learned about Azrith. Every child learned that Azrith had gone dormant after his rider's death and had never accepted another partner. Why are you not with the others? Azrith asked. Why are you not hiding in your shelter like the rest of your kind? Kale wanted to say he did not know. He wanted to say he was scared and confused and had no idea what was happening. But, when he opened his mouth, different words came out. Because you called me. Because I could feel you calling. You have been calling for so long, and nobody could hear you. But, I can hear you. I have always been able to hear you. The great dragon's eye narrowed, and, for a moment Kale was certain he was about to die. Then, Azrith pulled back, and something that might have been laughter rumbled through the mental connection. The last true empath in 10 generations, and he is shoveling waste in our stables. How fitting that the universe would hide its greatest gift in the humblest of packages. The other ancient dragons stirred, their attention focusing on Kale with an intensity that threatened to crush his consciousness beneath its weight. He could feel their curiosity, their hope, their desperate longing. These beings had been alone for centuries, trapped in their own power, unable to connect with the limited minds of modern writers. And, now, impossibly, a boy who should have been nothing had walked into their prison and spoken to them as an equal. The ground shook with another explosion, closer this time. Through the mental link, Kale could sense the battle raging above them. The younger dragons were fighting bravely, but there were too many ZYR ships. The defense was crumbling. Without reinforcement, the world would fall within hours. The ancient dragons felt it too, and their attention turned from Kale to the crisis at hand. Our children are dying, spoke a dragon whose scales shimmered with colors that had no name. They fight alone because we have slept too long. We cannot join them, answered another, this one radiating sorrow like a physical force. We have no riders. Without a bond, we would lose ourselves to the battle rage. We would destroy friend and enemy alike. Azrith as I found Kale once more, and, in that ancient gaze, he saw something that terrified and excited him in equal measure. Unless the empath would bond with us. The suggestion sent shockwaves through the group. Multiple voices erupted at once, protests and agreements overlapping in a chaos of mental energy that threatened to tear Kale's mind apart. He grabbed his head, crying out in pain, and instantly the noise stopped. The dragons pulled back, their power carefully contained. He is untrained, someone objected. A bond with one of us would kill him. It would burn out his mind before he could complete the connection. And yet he stands before us unharmed, Azrith countered. He has felt our power since he arrived. He has grown strong without knowing it. How many of our riders could say the same at the moment of first contact? Kale's head was spinning. Bond with them? With one of the ancient dragons? The very idea was insane. Normal riders spent years training for their bonds, building up their mental defenses, learning to share their consciousness with a single dragon without losing themselves. What they were suggesting would be like trying to hold an ocean in his hands. But, even as fear coursed through him, another feeling rose to meet it. All his life, he had felt different. All his life, he had been alone, unable to connect with other humans in any meaningful way, always sensing things that others could not. What if this was why? What if everything in his life had been leading to this moment? Outside, the sky was burning. People were dying. The world he had known was being torn apart by an enemy that had haunted humanity's nightmares for millennia. And, here, in this dark chamber, the only beings with enough power to turn the tide were offering him a choice. I will do it, he said, and the words felt right in a way nothing else ever had. If it will save them, I will try. Azritha's approval washed over him like warm sunlight, and the great dragon rose to its full height. The other ancients drew closer, their combined power creating a pressure that made the air shimmer. Then, we begin, Azrith said. And, may the universe forgive us for what we are about to do to you. The bond hit Kale like a supernova. He had thought he understood what it meant to feel the dragons. He had thought his sensitivity was something special, something that set him apart. But, as Azritha's consciousness merged with his own, he realized that everything he had experienced before was nothing more than a whisper. This was the full symphony. Power flooded through him, ancient and vast, carrying with it memories that were not his own. He saw the birth of stars and the death of worlds. He felt the joy of first flight and the agony of watching a beloved rider grow old and die. He experienced the horror of the first contact wars, the screaming of high fleets as they were consumed by dragonfire, the terrible silence of victory bought at the cost of millions of lives. And, through it all, he felt Azritha's grief. Centuries of grief, bottled up inside a creature that had never stopped mourning the partner it had lost. The dragon had been waiting, not just for any empath, but for someone who could understand that grief, who could help carry it, who could give meaning to all those years of lonely darkness. Kale's body lifted from the ground, surrounded by energy that crackled and sparked with visible lightning. He could feel himself changing, his mind expanding to accommodate powers that should have destroyed him. The other ancient dragons added their strength, stabilizing the bond, preventing it from burning out his fragile human consciousness. When it was done, he opened his eyes and saw the world in ways he had never imagined. The walls of the enclosure were no longer solid barriers but thin membranes of matter that he could perceive at the molecular level. The battle above was not a distant confusion but a clear tactical display painted directly into his awareness. He could feel every dragon on the planet, every rider, every ZYR ship in orbit. He understood their positions, their movements, their intentions, all of it processed and analyzed in the space between heartbeats. And, beneath him, responding to his thoughts as naturally as his own limbs, was Azrith. The great black dragon spread its wings, and Kale felt the motion as if those wings were his own. They were connected now, not as rider and mount, but as two halves of a single being. Where Azrith ended and Kale began, neither of them could say. The other ancient dragons were awake now, truly awake for the first time in centuries. They had no riders, but they had Kale, and, through him, they had something almost as good. His empathic abilities allowed him to project a stabilizing influence over all of them, giving them the anchor they needed to act without losing themselves. "Let us remind the ZYR why they learned to fear humanity," Azrith said. And, together, they rose to meet the enemy. The stable roof exploded outward as Azrith launched itself into the sky, and Kale felt nothing but exhilaration. Behind them, the other ancients followed, their forms blocking out the sun as they climbed. 5 dragons that should not have been flying. 5 legends that should have remained asleep. 5 nightmares from the ZYR collective memory, returned to finish what they had started 2,000 years ago. Above, the battle paused. Friend and foe alike stopped to stare at what was rising from the surface. The younger dragons screamed in recognition, their cries mixing joy and awe in equal measure. The ZYR ships faltered, their hive mind suddenly flooded with ancestral terror that their living crews had never personally experienced. Kale reached out with his new senses, touching the mind of every dragon on the planet. He felt their exhaustion, their fear, their determination. He felt their relief at the arrival of reinforcements. And he felt something else, something that took him a moment to understand. Hope. They had been losing. They had known they were going to die. And, now, impossibly, they had a chance. "Follow us," Kale broadcast, his voice carried on waves of psychic power that reached every dragon simultaneously. "Today, we show them what humanity and its partners can do." The battle for Draconis Prime was about to change. Lord Varen Drakemore had thought himself prepared for anything. He had served the Dragon Guard for 30 years, had fought pirates and raiders and the occasional rogue dragon, had seen things that would break lesser men. But nothing had prepared him for what he was seeing now. The stable boy. The boy he had noticed briefly that morning for no reason he could explain. That boy was riding Azrith the Eternal as if he had been born to it. More than riding. He was commanding the ancient dragons, coordinating their attacks with a precision that put the Guard's best tactical officers to shame. The ZYR were dying by the thousands. Their ships, so invincible against conventional weapons, simply dissolved when exposed to the ancient's breath. Their tactics, so effective against the younger dragons, collapsed when faced with creatures that had been fighting their kind before their species had even developed interstellar travel. And, at the center of it all was the stable boy, his eyes blazing with power that should not have been possible, his voice ringing in the minds of every dragon as he directed the counterattack. Varen had served the Imperium his entire life. He had given everything to the cause, had sacrificed family and health and happiness on the altar of duty. And, in all that time, he had never seen true potential realized. Until now. The boy was raw, untrained, operating on instinct and borrowed knowledge. But there was something in him that went beyond training, beyond experience. There was a connection to the dragons that the best riders could only dream of. And, in this moment, in this desperate hour, that connection was saving the world. Whatever happens next, Varen thought as he watched the ZYR flagship begin its death spiral toward the planet's surface, nothing will ever be the same again. He was right. Kale did not know how long the battle lasted. Time had lost meaning somewhere between his first mental command and the moment when the last ZYR vessel broke and ran for the edge of the system. He only knew that when it was over, he was still alive, still bonded to Azrith, still riding through the sky on wings of shadow and starlight. The planet below was scarred but surviving. The cities had held. The population centers had been protected. Losses were significant but not catastrophic. It was a victory, the kind of victory that would be celebrated for generations to come. And, at the heart of that victory was a stable boy who should have been invisible. As Kale brought Azrith down to land on the ruined plaza where the surviving dragons were gathering, he saw the faces of the riders who had fought beside him. There was awe there, and fear, and uncertainty. He was an anomaly, something that should not exist, a threat to every established hierarchy in the Imperium. But there was also gratitude. However they felt about him personally, they could not deny what he had done. Lord Varen approached, his dragon limping behind him, both of them bearing the marks of hard combat. The older man stopped a few feet away and stared up at Kale with an expression that was impossible to read. "Who are you?" Varen asked, and, despite everything, his voice carried genuine curiosity. Kale considered the question. Who was he? A stable boy? An empath? A dragon rider? All of those things and none of them seemed to capture the truth. "I am Kale," he said finally. "And I am not sure what I am becoming. But I promise you this, Lord Varen. Whatever I am, I will use it to protect humanity. That is the only thing I know for certain." Varen studied him for a long moment, then slowly nodded. "That will have to be enough for now. But understand this, boy. The Imperium does not like things it does not understand. There will be consequences for what happened today. There will be people who want to use you, control you, or destroy you. You have painted a target on your back that will never come off." Kale felt Azritha's amusement ripple through their bond, the ancient dragon amused by the small concerns of politics and power. "Then, I will have to be ready for them," Kale replied. "And I will not be alone." He looked at the sky, where the other ancient dragons circled, their majestic forms a promise of power that had not been seen in the galaxy for centuries. He looked at the younger dragons, who watched him with new respect in their glowing eyes. And he looked inward, at the bond that had changed everything, at the potential that was only beginning to unfold. The universe was vast and dangerous and full of enemies who wanted humanity extinct. But humanity had survived. Humanity had adapted. And now humanity had something new. It had a stable boy who had touched the minds of gods and lived to tell the tale. The story was just beginning. 3 weeks had passed since the Battle of Draconis Prime, and Kale had not slept more than a few hours at a time. His body no longer seemed to require the same rest it once did, another change that the Imperial physicians could not explain. They had run every test imaginable, scanned his brain with instruments that cost more than a starship, and consulted with experts from a dozen different worlds. Their conclusion was always the same. What had happened to Kale should have been impossible, and they had no framework for understanding it. The bond with Azrith had done something fundamental to his physiology. His neurons fired faster. His cognitive capacity had expanded by factors they could not measure. And his empathic abilities, which had once been limited to sensing the emotions of nearby dragons, now reached across the entire planet. He could feel every dragon on Draconis Prime, could touch their minds if he concentrated, could coordinate their movements with a thought. It terrified the Imperial authorities. Kale sat in a waiting room that was designed to intimidate. The walls were made of polished black stone, and the furniture was sparse and uncomfortable. Holographic portraits of previous emperors stared down at him with painted disapproval, their stern faces a reminder that the Galactic Imperium did not tolerate disruption to its established order. He had been summoned to the capital world of Throne Prime 3 days ago, pulled away from Draconis Prime on an Imperial transport that had arrived with an escort of 6 battlecruisers. They had treated him with respect, but the respect of people handling something dangerous. No one had threatened him directly. No one had needed to. Azritha's presence in his mind was a constant comfort, the ancient dragon maintaining their connection across the vast distance of space. Through that bond, Kale could feel the other ancients as well, their massive consciousnesses brushing against his own like ships passing in an endless ocean. They were concerned for him, worried about what the Imperium might do, but they were also confident. They had watched humanity for thousands of years. They knew that whatever happened next, Kale had something the Imperium needed desperately. The door to the inner chamber finally opened, and a young woman in the uniform of an Imperial page stepped through. "The High Council will see you now," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Please follow me." Kale rose and walked through the door, entering a room that was clearly designed to overwhelm. The ceiling soared 50 feet above his head, supported by pillars of white marble veined with gold. The floor was a mosaic depicting famous battles from human history, each tile placed by hand over centuries of careful work. At the far end of the room, seated on raised thrones arranged in a semicircle, were the 7 most powerful people in the known galaxy. The High Council of the Galactic Imperium consisted of representatives from each of the major power blocks that held the fractious human civilization together. There was the military executor, who commanded the vast fleets that protected imperial space. There was the trade minister, who controlled the economic lifeblood of 1,000 worlds. There was the science directorate chair, who oversaw the research institutions that kept humanity at the technological edge. And there were 4 others, each equally powerful, each equally invested in maintaining the status quo that had kept the Imperium stable for generations. They looked at Kale the way scientists might look at a new and, potentially dangerous organism. Kale of Draconis Prime, the military executor began, his voice echoing through the vast chamber. You stand before this council accused of no crime but summoned here for explanation. 3 weeks ago, you bonded with 5 ancient dragons simultaneously and led them in battle against a ZYRKeth invasion fleet. You demonstrated abilities that have not been seen in a human being for over 200 years. You saved a world. And, in doing so, you upset a balance of power that has been carefully maintained for centuries. Kale listened without interrupting. He had been prepared for this, had known since the battle ended that his actions would have consequences beyond the immediate victory. The dragon riders of the Imperium were a carefully controlled resource, their bonds monitored and regulated, their powers kept in check by traditions and laws designed to prevent any one rider from becoming too powerful. What Kale had done violated every one of those traditions. The ancient dragons have been dormant for 300 years, the science directorate chair continued. They were considered inert, dangerous relics of a more violent age. We had protocols in place for their eventual termination should they ever pose a threat. Now they are awake, they are active, and they are bonded to you. A stable boy. An orphan with no family, no training, and no allegiance to any of the great houses. She leaned forward, her eyes sharp with intelligence and suspicion. Do you understand why this concerns us? Kale met her gaze without flinching. The old Kale, the one who had spent years hiding in the shadows of the stable, would have been too terrified to speak. But that Kale was gone, burned away in the fire of his transformation. In his place stood something new, someone who had touched the minds of beings older than human civilization and emerged changed. I understand that you are afraid, he said, and his voice carried clearly through the chamber despite its quiet tone. You have spent centuries building a system that controls the power of dragons and riders, keeping them divided and dependent on imperial authority. My existence threatens that control. The ancient dragons, awakened, active and loyal to me rather than to your structures, threaten it even more. Murmurs rippled through the council, some angry, some surprised at his directness. Kale continued. But, I also understand something that perhaps you have forgotten. The ZYRKeth are not defeated. The fleet that attacked Draconis Prime was a scouting force, testing our defenses, probing our capabilities. The main hive is still out there, growing stronger, preparing for a war that will make the first contact wars look like a border skirmish. And, when they come, you will need every dragon, every rider, every weapon you can muster. He let those words hang in the air, watching as the council members exchanged uneasy glances. They knew he was right. The intelligence reports had been flooding in since the battle, revealing ZYRKeth activity in sectors that had been considered secure for generations. Something had awakened the ancient enemy, and whatever came next would test humanity's strength in ways they had not faced since the founding of the Imperium. The trade minister, a heavy man with calculating eyes, spoke next. You speak as if you have a solution to offer. What is it that you want, stable boy? Power? Wealth? A title to match your new abilities? Name your price, and perhaps we can negotiate. Kale felt Azritha's disgust at the offer ripple through their bond, the ancient dragon's opinion of politicians well established over millennia of observation. But Kale had expected this approach and had prepared his response. I want to establish a new academy, he said. A place where those with empathic abilities can be found and trained, where they can learn to bond with dragons in ways that your current system does not allow. The traditional rider training focuses on control and domination, on forcing the dragon to obey. But what I experienced is something different. It is a true partnership, a merging of minds that amplifies the power of both human and dragon beyond what either could achieve alone. The military executor scoffed. You propose to train an army of beings like yourself? Beings who could bond with multiple dragons, who could command forces beyond our ability to control. That is not a solution. That is a threat. It is a necessity, Kale replied calmly. The ZYRKeth have been evolving in the centuries since we last faced them. Their hive minds have grown more sophisticated, their technology more advanced. The tactics that defeated them before will not work again. We need to evolve as well, to unlock potentials that humanity has ignored or suppressed. Otherwise, we will lose. Silence fell over the chamber as the council members considered his words. Finally, the oldest of them spoke, a woman named Elena Vorsmith who had served on the council for nearly 50 years and was rumored to be one of the few people the emperor himself actually listened to. You speak of partnership with the dragons, she said, her voice thin but clear. Yet the history of human and dragon relations is filled with stories of riders who lost themselves to their bonds, who became more dragon than human, who turned against their own kind in fits of madness. How do we know that you are not already lost? How do we know that your proposals are your own and not the manipulations of beings who have their own agendas? Kale had been waiting for this question. It was the heart of the matter, the fear that underlay all the political maneuvering and power calculations. And he had an answer, one that Azrith had helped him formulate during the long journey to Throne Prime. You cannot know, he admitted. Not with certainty. But I can show you. He closed his eyes and reached out with his mind, not to the distant dragons he was bonded with, but to something else. Something hidden within the palace itself, something that even the council did not know was there. In the depths of the imperial palace, in a vault that had been sealed for 400 years, an egg began to crack. The council chamber erupted in chaos as alarms blared throughout the building. Security forces burst through the doors, weapons drawn, demanding to know what was happening. But Kale remained calm, his eyes still closed, his attention focused on the small life that was emerging far below. The dragon that hatched was different from any that had been born in centuries. It was tiny, no larger than a house cat, with scales that shifted through every color in the spectrum. And it was already bonded, its mind reaching out through the layers of stone and steel to touch the consciousness that had called it into existence. Kale opened his eyes and smiled. This is how I prove my intentions, he said. This dragon was hidden here centuries ago, placed in stasis by an emperor who believed that humanity would one day need a new beginning. It has been waiting for someone capable of awakening it. I could have kept this secret, could have claimed this power for myself without your knowledge. Instead, I am offering it to you. A partnership. A new way forward. The small dragon arrived in the chamber carried by a confused security officer who clearly had no idea what to do with the tiny creature now perched on his shoulder. It chirped once, then launched itself into the air, flying directly to Kale and settling on his outstretched arm. The council members stared, their political masks finally cracking to reveal the genuine shock beneath. A new dragon, bonded at hatching, something that had not happened since the founding of the great houses. The implications were staggering. Elena Vorsmith rose from her throne, her ancient legs steady despite her years. It seems, she said slowly, that the universe has chosen to send us a message. Whether that message is salvation or destruction remains to be seen. But I believe we would be fools to ignore it. She turned to address her fellow council members. I move that we grant Kale of Draconis Prime provisional authority to establish his academy. He will have resources, support, and protection, but he will also be watched closely. At the first sign that he is becoming a threat to imperial stability, that authority will be revoked, by force if necessary. All in favor? The vote was not unanimous, but it was enough. For hands rose, with only 3 remaining down. Kale had his academy. But, as he left the chamber, the small dragon still perched on his arm, he knew that his challenges were only beginning. The council members who had voted against him would not accept this decision quietly. The established rider houses would see him as a threat to their power. And, somewhere out there, the ZYRKeth were preparing for a war that would test everything humanity had built. The transport that had brought Kale to Throne Prime was waiting when he reached the palace landing pad, but it was no longer alone. A sleek vessel of unfamiliar design had landed beside it, and, standing at its base was a figure that made Kale's newly enhanced senses tingle with danger. She was tall, taller than any human he had ever seen, with skin that seemed to shift between shades of blue and purple depending on how the light struck it. Her eyes were entirely black, without pupil or iris, and her features were too perfect to be entirely natural. She wore a tight-fitting suit of some metallic fabric, and her posture was that of a predator at rest. "Kale of Draconis Prime," she said, and her voice carried harmonics that brushed against his mind in ways he did not like. "My name is Serena. I represent the Confederacy of Independent Systems, and I have traveled a very long way to meet you." Kale stopped, the small dragon on his arm flaring its wings in warning. The Confederacy was the other major human power in the galaxy, a collection of worlds that had broken away from the Imperium during the Schism Wars 2 centuries ago. They had their own dragons, their own riders, and their own agenda. Their relationship with the Imperium was one of cold rivalry, maintained only by the mutual threat of the HFY. "Why would the Confederacy send someone to meet me?" he asked. "I am no one of importance." Serena smiled, and the expression was beautiful and terrifying. "We both know that is no longer true. The battle at Draconis Prime was witnessed by our observers. We know what you did. We know what you are. And we have questions that only you can answer." She took a step closer, and Kale felt Azratha's warning pulse through their bond. The ancient dragon was far away, but his protective instincts were as strong as if he stood right beside his rider. "There is a prophecy among the dragons," Serena continued. "An old prophecy, from the time before humans left their birth world. It speaks of one who will unite all dragons, who will bridge the gap between human and dragon consciousness, who will either save both species or destroy them utterly. For generations, that prophecy was dismissed as myth. But now you have appeared, doing things that should be impossible, and we cannot afford to ignore the possibility that the myth is becoming reality." Kale felt cold despite the warm air of the landing pad. A prophecy? He had barely begun to understand his new abilities, and now he was learning that beings far older than him had been expecting someone like him to appear. "What do you want from me?" he asked. Serena's black eyes seemed to bore into his soul. "I want you to come with me. To our territory. To meet the dragons who remember the prophecy firsthand and to learn what it truly means. The Imperium will use you as a weapon, will chain your potential to their political games. We offer something different. We offer you knowledge, understanding, a chance to fulfill your destiny on your own terms. And if I refuse? Then you will face what is coming with only half the pieces of the puzzle. And the HFY, when they launch their main offensive, will not be the only enemy you face. There are powers in this galaxy that neither the Imperium nor the Confederacy fully understand. Powers that have been sleeping almost as long as the ancient dragons. And your awakening has begun to stir them as well." She turned and walked back toward her ship, pausing at the boarding ramp. "I will be at these coordinates for 7 days. After that, I return to the Confederacy, with or without you. Consider your options carefully, Kale of Draconis Prime. The future of 2 species may depend on your choice." The ship lifted off and vanished into the upper atmosphere, leaving Kale alone with his thoughts and the small dragon that was now nuzzling his chin in apparent unconcern. Through his bond with Azrath, he felt the ancient dragon's contemplation. The prophecy Serena had mentioned was not unknown to the ancients, but it was something they had not shared during their initial connection. There had been too much happening, too little time. Now, however, Azratha's thoughts were open, and Kale could see fragments of something vast and troubling. The prophecy was real. And it was far more complicated than a simple promise of salvation or destruction. The return journey to Draconis Prime gave Kale time to think. He spent hours in meditation, exploring the depths of his bond with Azrath, learning to navigate the vast libraries of memory that the ancient dragon carried within its consciousness. What he found there painted a picture of a universe far more complex and dangerous than anything he had imagined. The dragons were not native to the galaxy. They had arrived tens of thousands of years ago, refugees from a dying civilization somewhere far beyond the known stars. Their original forms had been different, more energy than matter, but they had evolved to survive in the physical universe, taking on the shapes that humans would one day call dragons. They had spread across the galaxy, finding world after world where they could live and grow, always searching for something they had lost in their original exodus. That something was a connection. In their original state, all dragons had been part of a single vast consciousness, a unified mind that spanned distances beyond human comprehension. The transition to physical form had fractured that unity, leaving each dragon isolated in its own body, capable of communication but never of the true merging they had once known. When humans developed psychic abilities, the dragons recognized something familiar. Here was a species that might one day bridge the gap, that might restore what had been lost. They had approached humanity not as masters or servants but as potential partners in a project that could take millennia to complete. The rider bonds were the first step, a crude but functional connection that allowed human and dragon to work together. But they were not the goal. The goal was something far greater, a true synthesis of human consciousness and dragon essence that would create something entirely new. The prophecy spoke of one who would achieve that synthesis. One who would unite all dragons through the power of a human mind, who would restore the connection that had been lost so long ago. And, if the prophecy was correct, that one would either lift both species to a new level of existence or destroy them utterly in the attempt. Kale was beginning to understand why the Council was so afraid. When his transport finally landed on Draconis Prime, Azrath was waiting for him. The massive black dragon had flown to the landing pad personally, something that caused a minor panic among the ground crews who had never seen an ancient dragon up close. But Kale ignored the commotion, walking directly to his bonded partner and pressing his forehead against the dragon's scale jaw. "I have learned much," he said through their mental link. "And I have much more to learn still." Azrath's response was warm with approval. The journey of 10,000 steps begins with a single footfall. You have taken more steps in 3 weeks than most riders take in a lifetime. Do not be discouraged by how far you still have to go. Around them, the other ancient dragons began to land, their massive forms making the landing pad feel suddenly very small. They had come to greet him, to welcome him back, to share in the bond that now connected all of them through Kale's consciousness. The small dragon from the palace vault climbed from Kale's shoulder to the top of Azrath's head, chirping a greeting that made the ancient creature rumble with something like laughter. A new generation meeting the oldest, connected by a stable boy who had found his purpose. Tomorrow, Kale knew, the real work would begin. He would have to build his academy, train the empaths he would find, prepare for wars both political and military. He would have to decide whether to accept Serena's invitation, whether to learn more about the prophecy that apparently governed his fate. He would have to become something more than he had ever imagined, rising from the lowest possible origins to stand among the most powerful beings in the galaxy. But tonight, surrounded by dragons who had chosen him, supported by bonds that transcended species and time, he allowed himself a moment of simple peace. The stable boy was gone. In his place stood something new, something that even the ancient dragons could not fully define. And the universe would never be the same. In orbit above Draconis Prime, hidden behind a moon's magnetic shadow where Imperial sensors could not penetrate, a ZYR-Keth observation probe recorded everything that had happened. The data was compressed and transmitted on frequencies humanity had not yet learned to detect, sent racing across the void to a destination far beyond the borders of known space. Deep in the heart of the hive, the Overmind received the transmission and processed its contents. The entity that served as the collective consciousness of the ZYR-Keth species was vast beyond human comprehension, a network of 1 trillion minds all working in perfect harmony. It had been planning this war for centuries, gathering strength, evolving new weapons, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The appearance of the empath changed its calculations. The awakening of the ancient dragons changed them further. The prophecy that the human female had mentioned was not unknown to the ZYR-Keth. They had encountered records of it during their first war with humanity, carved into the walls of dragon temples on conquered worlds. The Overmind considered its options. The original plan had called for a slow strangulation, cutting off human trade routes, destroying their industrial capacity, wearing them down over generations before the final assault. That plan assumed a humanity divided and weak, unable to access the full potential of their dragon allies. This new development required a new approach. The Overmind reached out to its children, the billions of ZYR-Keth soldiers waiting in their ships and breeding chambers, and delivered new instructions. The timeline was accelerating. The main offensive would begin not in decades but in months. And the primary target was no longer the industrial heart of the Imperium. It was a single world called Draconis Prime. It was a single human called Kale. The war for the future of the galaxy had truly begun. 6 months had transformed Draconis Prime from a world of tradition into something revolutionary. The Academy of the Unified Mind, as Kale had named it, occupied what had once been the largest stable complex on the planet. Its facilities had been expanded, rebuilt, and redesigned to serve a purpose that the original architects could never have imagined. Where once rows of dragon pens had stood in organized lines, now training halls and meditation chambers stretched across the landscape, filled with students who had come from every corner of the Imperium. Kale stood on the observation balcony of the central tower, watching as a group of first-year students attempted their initial contact exercises. Below him, a dozen young people sat in a circle around a juvenile dragon, their eyes closed, their minds reaching out in careful patterns that he had developed through months of trial and error. The dragon, a 3-year-old green named Whisper, had volunteered for the teaching duties, finding the experience of being touched by so many minds at once strangely pleasant. Finding the empaths had been easier than Kale expected. Once word spread about the Academy's purpose, people began coming forward with stories of sensing emotions they should not have felt, of knowing what animals were thinking, of dreams that showed them places they had never been. Most were young, their abilities still developing, their potential untapped. A few were older, people who had spent their lives hiding what they could do for fear of being labeled insane or dangerous. The traditional Rider Academies had not been pleased by this development. They saw the new school as a threat to their monopoly on dragon partnerships, and their representatives in the imperial bureaucracy had done everything possible to slow its growth. But Kale had something they lacked. He had the ancient dragons, and the ancient dragons had a weight of authority that no bureaucrat could easily ignore. A familiar presence brushed against his mind, and he turned to see Lyra approaching. She was one of his most promising students, a young woman from a mining colony who had accidentally bonded with a wild dragon at the age of 14 and had spent 3 years on the run before finding her way to the academy. Her abilities were almost as strong as Kale's own, though she lacked his connection to the ancients. "There is news," she said, her voice carrying an undertone of worry that she could not hide from his empathic senses. "The Confederacy has made contact again. They say that Serena is returning." Kale felt a chill run through him despite the warm air. He had never taken Serena up on her offer, had never traveled to the Confederacy to learn more about the prophecy she had mentioned. Part of him had been too busy building the academy. Part of him had been afraid of what he might learn. But her messages had continued arriving, each one more urgent than the last, warning of dangers that she claimed only she could explain. "When does she arrive?" he asked. "Tomorrow. She is bringing others with her. Dragons from the Confederacy, including some that are as old as the ancients here. They say they have information we need, something about the ZYRKeth that changes everything." Kale nodded slowly. He had felt the growing tension in the dragon's collective consciousness for weeks now, a sense of something building at the edges of known space. The Imperial Intelligence Services were reporting increased ZYRKeth activity, raids on remote outposts, probes of defense networks. Everyone knew that another attack was coming. The only questions were when and where. "Gather the council," he said. "We need to prepare for whatever Serena brings with her." The council that Kale had assembled was unlike any governing body the Imperium had ever seen. It included representatives from the traditional Rider houses, who had reluctantly accepted that the new methods were producing results. It included scientists from the research divisions, who had become fascinated by the neurological changes that the advanced bonding techniques produced. It included military officers, who saw in Kale's students a new weapon against the ZYRKeth threat. And it included dragons. For the first time in Imperial history, dragons sat as equal members of a governing body, their thoughts translated through empaths who served as living bridges between species. Azrath was there, his massive consciousness scaled down to a level that human minds could process without damage. 3 other ancients participated as well, their perspectives shaped by thousands of years of experience. The chamber where they met was designed to accommodate both species. One half featured standard seats and tables for the human members. The other half was open space where dragons could rest their massive bodies while maintaining mental contact with the proceedings. The ceiling was high enough to allow wing movement, and the walls were reinforced to withstand the occasional emotional outburst that could manifest as actual fire. Serena's message was displayed on screens throughout the room. The Confederacy representative had provided coordinates for a region of space that neither the Imperium nor the Confederacy had ever explored, deep in the unexplored sectors beyond the galactic rim. According to her data, there was something there that the ZYRKeth had been hiding for centuries. Something that explained their sudden aggression. Something that threatened not just humanity but every sentient species in the galaxy. The gathered council members studied the information with expressions ranging from skepticism to fear. General Marcus Thorne, the Imperial military's liaison to the Academy, was the first to speak. "This is remarkably convenient timing," he said, his tone dripping with suspicion. "The Confederacy just happens to have intelligence about a secret ZYRKeth facility that requires a joint expedition to investigate? This smells like a trap." Through the mental link, Azratha's response came to Kale first, who then translated for those without empathic abilities. "The dragons of the Confederacy are no more enemies of their humans than we are of ours. If they are endorsing this message, it is because they believe its content. Dragons do not play political games the way your species does." "That does not mean they cannot be deceived," another council member pointed out. "Or that their interests align perfectly with ours." The debate continued for hours, arguments flowing back and forth about the risks and benefits of trusting the Confederacy's information. Kale listened carefully, absorbing perspectives from all sides, feeling the emotional undercurrents that revealed what people truly thought beneath their diplomatic words. When the discussion finally reached an impasse, he stood to address the council. "I have remained quiet because I wanted to hear all of your views before sharing my own. Now I will tell you what I believe." The room fell silent, all attention focused on the young man who had risen from nothing to become the center of galactic attention. "Serena's information may be genuine or it may be a deception. We have no way to know for certain without investigating. But there is something I have not shared with you, something that the ancient dragons revealed to me during our bonding. The ZYRKeth are not the only threat we face." He paused, gathering his thoughts, reaching into the vast store of memories that Azrath had shared with him. When the dragons first arrived in this galaxy, they were not alone. Another species had followed them, creatures of pure psychic energy that fed on consciousness the way the ZYRKeth feed on organic matter. The dragons called them the Voidwalkers, and the war against them lasted for millennia before both species were weakened to the point of near extinction. The Voidwalkers retreated into dimensions beyond normal space, places where they could survive without physical hosts. And there they have remained, sleeping and recovering, waiting for an opportunity to return. The council members exchanged alarmed glances. This was information that had never appeared in any historical record, any scientific database, any dragon legend accessible to humanity. "The ZYRKeth know about the Voidwalkers," Kale continued. "They have always known. In fact, the reason they attacked humanity so viciously during the First Contact Wars was not territorial ambition or resource competition. It was fear. They saw humans bonding with dragons, saw the psychic abilities that partnership created, and they believed we were the key to the Voidwalkers' return. In their minds, wiping us out was the only way to prevent a catastrophe that would consume the entire galaxy." General Thorne's face had gone pale. "You are saying that our greatest enemy was trying to protect us? That the wars that killed millions of our ancestors were fought because the ZYRKeth were afraid of something else?" "I am saying that the situation is more complicated than anyone realized. The ZYRKeth were wrong about us. We are not the Voidwalkers' allies or their servants. But they were right to be afraid. My awakening, the awakening of the ancient dragons, the development of true empathic bonds between human and dragon consciousness. These things are sending ripples through the psychic fabric of the galaxy. And if the Voidwalkers sense those ripples, if they realize that the dragons are strong again and that humanity is developing abilities that could threaten them, they may decide to act before we become too powerful to stop." He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of human and dragon alike. "Serena's information points to a region of space where the ZYRKeth have been studying something for centuries. I believe that something is a Voidwalker artifact, a gateway or a prison or something else that connects our dimension to theirs. If I am right, then we cannot afford to ignore it. We need to know what the ZYRKeth have found and what they plan to do with it." The vote that followed was decisive. The council authorized an expedition to the coordinates Serena had provided, a joint mission that would include ships and dragons from both the Imperium and the Confederacy. It would be the first cooperative military operation between the two human powers since their separation, a moment of potential healing or potential disaster. Kale would lead the expedition personally, along with his most advanced students and as many of the ancient dragons as were willing to make the journey. The days before departure were filled with preparations that pushed everyone to their limits. Ships had to be modified to carry dragons across interstellar distances. Supplies had to be gathered for a mission of unknown duration. Intelligence had to be analyzed and plans had to be made for scenarios that no one could truly predict. Kale spent much of his time in communion with the ancient dragons, drawing on their memories of the Voidwalker War, learning everything they could tell him about an enemy that most of the galaxy had forgotten. What he learned terrified him. The Voidwalkers were not simply another hostile species like the HFY. They were something else entirely, beings that existed in states of matter and energy that human science could barely conceptualize. In their true form, they could not even interact with the physical universe. But they had learned to create extensions of themselves, projections that could manipulate matter and energy in devastating ways. These projections fed on consciousness, draining the psychic energy of any sentient being they encountered, leaving behind nothing but empty shells. The dragons had fought them to a standstill through sheer power and numbers, burning the projections with fire that touched not just physical matter but the underlying fabric of space itself. But the cost had been enormous. Billions of dragons had died. Entire star systems had been destroyed. And, in the end, the Voidwalkers had not been defeated, only driven back, forced to retreat into their own dimension until they could recover their strength. That was 20,000 years ago, Azrith told Kale during one of their meditation sessions. We believed the threat was over. We believed that the barriers between dimensions would hold forever. But nothing lasts forever, not even the walls between worlds. How do we fight them? Kale asked. If they come back now, before we are ready? Azrith's response carried the weight of ancient sorrow. We hope that we do not have to. We hope that whatever the HFY have found can be destroyed before it can be used. And if that hope fails, we fight with everything we have and pray that it is enough. The night before the expedition launched, Kale walked through the quiet halls of the academy, visiting each of the students who had been chosen to accompany him. They were the best of the best, young empaths whose abilities had developed at astonishing rates under his guidance. Some of them would not return from this mission. He could feel that probability in the currents of fate that his enhanced senses allowed him to perceive. But they had all volunteered. They had all understood the risks. And they had all decided that the possibility of failure was worth the chance to protect everything they loved. Lyra found him in the meditation garden near the academy's heart, sitting alone among flowers that glowed with bioluminescent colors in the darkness. You should be resting, she said, settling down beside him. Tomorrow will be difficult. Kale smiled faintly. I have not slept normally since my bonding with Azrith. My mind is too active, too connected to too many others. Sometimes I wonder if I will ever truly rest again. Is that what you want? Rest? He considered the question carefully. I want to know that the people I care about are safe. I want to see the academy grow and thrive. I want to understand what I am becoming and whether it is something that will help or harm. But rest? No. I think rest is for people whose work is finished. Mine has barely begun. They sat together in comfortable silence, two young people who had found purpose in a universe that often seemed determined to crush anyone who dared to hope for something better. The dragons slept around them, their dreams mixing with the ambient psychic energy of the planet, creating patterns that only empaths could perceive. When dawn came, it brought with it the roar of engines and the beating of massive wings. The expedition fleet rose from Draconis Prime like a swarm of stars ascending to their proper places in the sky. Battlecruisers and dragon carriers, scout ships and support vessels, all moving in formation toward the edge of explored space. At the heart of the formation flew Azrith, carrying Kale on his back as they had during the battle that had changed everything. The other ancient dragons flanked them, their vast forms dwarfing even the largest of the Imperial warships. And, alongside them flew dragons from the Confederacy, their scales marked with the distinctive patterns of their home worlds, their riders regarding the Imperials with wariness that was slowly giving way to grudging respect. Serena's ship flew near the front of the formation, the Confederacy representative having taken personal command of her people's contribution to the expedition. She had met with Kale briefly before departure, their conversation conducted in the shared mental space that empaths could create. What she had told him had confirmed his worst fears. The HFY facility was real. It had been built around a tear in the fabric of space itself, a wound that connected normal reality to the dimension where the Voidwalkers waited. For centuries, the HFY had been studying that wound, trying to find a way to seal it permanently, trying to prevent the catastrophe they believed was inevitable. They had failed. The tear was growing. Something was pushing through from the other side, testing the barriers, probing for weaknesses.
The ZYRKeth's recent aggression against humanity was not just fear of what empaths might become.
It was desperation. They believed that the only way to stop the Voidwalkers was to deny them the psychic energy they needed, and the combination of humans and dragons represented the largest source of such energy in the known galaxy. If they could destroy humanity and scatter the dragons, they might starve the Voidwalkers long enough for the tear to heal naturally. It was a brutal calculus, but, from the ZYRKeth perspective, it was the only logical choice.
Kale understood their thinking, even if he could never accept their solution.
The ZYRKeth saw the galaxy as a zero-sum game, where the survival of one species required the destruction of others.
Humanity had to prove them wrong. They had to find another way.
The journey to the coordinates took 3 weeks of travel through hyperspace, 3 weeks of tension and preparation and quiet conversations about what might be waiting at their destination.
The crews trained constantly, running simulations of every scenario the tactical officers could imagine.
The dragons practiced formation flying and combat maneuvers that had not been used since the first contact wars. And Kale worked with his empaths, helping them build the mental connections that would allow them to function as a single coordinated force when the fighting began. By the time they reached their destination, his students had become something new. Not just individual empaths but a linked collective, their minds joined in a web of shared awareness that allowed them to react to threats faster than any human force had ever managed. The dragons felt it too, drawn into the web through their bonds, their ancient power amplified by the harmony of human consciousness. The star system they entered was dark and cold, orbiting a dying red giant that shed barely enough light to see by.
But it was not empty.
The ZYRKeth fleet waiting for them was the largest concentration of enemy forces anyone had ever seen, thousands of ships arranged in defensive positions around a planet that glowed with unnatural energy.
And, at the center of that glow was something that made even the ancient dragons hesitate. A hole in space.
Not a hyperspace portal or a dimensional gateway but an actual absence, a place where reality itself had been torn away. It pulsed with colors that human eyes were not designed to perceive, and, from its depths came a sound that was not quite sound, a pressure that was not quite pressure, a hunger that reached across the void to touch every mind in the expedition. The Voidwalkers knew they were coming.
And they were waiting. The ZYRKeth did not attack immediately.
Instead, a single vessel broke from their formation and approached the expedition fleet, broadcasting signals of peaceful intent that no one quite believed. But the dragons could sense something unusual in the minds of the creatures aboard that ship, something that was not the cold hostility they had always associated with the hive mind.
There was fear there.
And, beneath the fear, the first tentative stirrings of hope. Kale agreed to meet with the ZYRKeth representatives aboard a neutral shuttle, accompanied by Lyra and 3 of his best students. The ancient dragons maintained a protective circle around the small vessel, ready to intervene if the meeting proved to be a trap.
The ZYRKeth delegate was unlike any of its kind that Kale had seen before.
Where most of the insectoid species were soldier drones, their bodies optimized for combat, this one was clearly something else. Its carapace was decorated with intricate patterns that seemed to shift as he watched, and its multiple eyes held an intelligence that felt different from the simple predatory focus of its warriors. "I am the voice of the Overmind," it said, using a translator device that converted its clicking mandibles into comprehensible human speech.
"I have been authorized to speak on behalf of my entire species."
The voice explained what the ZYRKeth had been trying to accomplish for centuries. Their scientists had studied the dimensional tear, had developed theories about what lay on the other side, had created weapons designed to destroy the Voidwalker projections if they ever managed to cross over. But their technology was failing. The tear was growing despite their best efforts, and the presence beyond it was becoming stronger with each passing year. They had turned to aggression against humanity not out of malice but out of logic. In their calculations, reducing the available psychic energy in the galaxy was the only way to slow the Voidwalkers' approach. But now, facing the combined might of the expedition fleet and the power of beings like Kale, they were reconsidering. "You represent a possibility we had not accounted for," the voice continued. "A force that might be able to do what our weapons cannot. If there is any chance that you can seal the tear permanently, we are willing to suspend hostilities and offer our assistance."
"In exchange for what?" Kale asked, his empathic senses probing the alien's consciousness for signs of deception.
"In exchange for survival. If the Voidwalkers break through, they will not distinguish between human and ZYRKeth. They will consume us all without preference or mercy. Our species has existed for millions of years, and we have no desire to see that existence end."
Kale considered the offer carefully. The ZYRKeth had been humanity's enemies for so long that the idea of cooperation seemed almost impossible. But he could feel the truth in the voice's words, the genuine terror that underlay its species' actions. They were not evil in the way humans understood evil. They were simply different, operating according to logic that valued collective survival above all else. And, right now, that logic was telling them that working with humanity was their best chance of avoiding extinction. "I will need to consult with my allies," Kale said. "This is not a decision I can make alone." The voice inclined its head in what might have been a gesture of respect. "We understand. But time is short. The presence beyond the tear grows more active with each passing hour. Whatever we are going to do, we must do it soon." The meeting ended, and Kale returned to the flagship to share what he had learned. The council members who had accompanied the expedition argued for hours about the wisdom of trusting their ancient enemy. But, in the end, the decision was made not by votes or arguments but by the dragons. Azrath and the other ancients had listened to the entire exchange through their link with Kale. They had felt the truth in the ZYRKeth's sphere, had sensed the approaching threat from the dimensional tear. And they had reached a conclusion that surprised everyone. "We will work with them," Azrath announced, his mental voice reaching every mind in the fleet. Not as allies, not as friends, but as fellow survivors facing a common enemy. "When the crisis is past, we can return to our disputes. But, first, we must ensure that there is a galaxy left to dispute over." With the ancient dragon's endorsement, the decision was made. The combined fleet would approach the dimensional tear together. The ZYRKeth would provide covering fire against any Voidwalker projections that emerged. And Kale and his empaths would attempt something that had never been tried before. They would enter the tear itself and try to seal it from the inside. It was a plan born of desperation and hope in equal measure. The chances of success were impossible to calculate, and the chances of survival were probably worse. But, as Kale looked out at the dark void of space, feeling the ancient evil that lurked just beyond the barrier of normal reality, he knew that there was no other choice. The stable boy had come a long way from the pens of Draconis Prime. Now he would find out if his journey had been enough. The approach to the dimensional tear was the longest hour of Kale's life. Around him, the combined fleet moved in careful formation, ZYRKeth vessels flying alongside human ships in a pattern that would have been unthinkable just days ago. The ancient enemies kept their weapons trained on each other even as they faced the greater threat together, trust being built one cautious moment at a time. Kale rode on Azrath's back, the great dragon's wings folded against the vacuum of space, propulsion provided by systems that were more psychic than mechanical. The ancient dragons had technologies that human science had never understood, capabilities that had been dormant for centuries but were now awakening in response to the crisis. They did not need air to breathe or fuel to fly. They moved through space as naturally as they moved through atmosphere, their bodies adapted to survive in conditions that would kill any organic creature. The tear grew larger as they approached, its unnatural colors painting the void in shades that hurt to look at. Through his enhanced senses, Kale could feel the wrongness of it, a violation of natural law that screamed against every instinct his mind possessed. The Voidwalkers had created this wound in reality, or perhaps they had simply exploited one that already existed. Either way, it was a door that should never have been opened. Something moved on the other side. Something vast and hungry and aware. It had sensed the approaching fleet, had felt the concentration of psychic energy that the dragons and empaths represented. And it was interested. The first Voidwalker projection emerged when they were still thousands of kilometers from the tear. It was not a physical creature in any meaningful sense, more like a shadow given form and purpose. It rippled through space without regard for the laws that govern normal matter, its shape constantly shifting between configurations that the human mind could barely process. The ZYRKeth opened fire immediately, their weapons designed specifically for this threat. Energy beams that burned through dimensional barriers rather than physical matter. Missiles that carried payloads of compressed psychic energy. Weapons that had been developed over centuries of research, all pointed at the thing that had haunted their species' nightmares for longer than humanity had existed. The projection twisted and writhed under the assault, parts of its form dissolving only to reform moments later. It was not truly alive, could not be truly killed. It was just an extension of something far greater, a finger reaching through a crack in a door to test what lay on the other side. Then, the dragons attacked. Azrath.